behalf of the UCSD Transdisciplinary Studies Research Group, I welcome you all to the Symposium on Disability, Intersectionality, and State Violence. It encompasses a set of difficult, painful, and important concerns that we are all implicated in. Within interdisciplinary field of disability studies, intersectional issues are gaining greater attention, and yet still under-considered. And when we think about intersectional issues in relationship to disability studies, it's not only intersections with other typical categories of race, class, gender, sexuality, et cetera, but also within the different categories that people either identify with as disabled or not, the many forms of disability. There's also sorts of intersections within there. Although we occupy a spectrum of relations to the intersectional identities that experience extremely heightened vulnerability to state violence, we all play a role in processes and dialogues that maintain or hopefully disassemble our society's institutionalized sites of violence. As our name suggests, the UCSD Transdisciplinary Disability Studies Research Group is a group of people from across the disciplines. We don't have disability studies minor or major here, but we have all sorts of dedicated people in different departments. We got small funding from the the Institute of Arts and Humanities to fund a group where some faculty work with graduate students to plan events. And so this is the outcome of that. If you're interested in getting on our mailing list, this is the email to send to me or whoever in the group, and you'll be put on our list. It's not a list that gets a lot of emails, so you don't have to worry about that. It's mostly when we have key events, and so there's one coming up this coming week, which I'm very excited about. We're having Ann Finger reading from her new novel, Woman in Bed. Ann Finger is a long-term activist and writer, educator, cultural worker who's worked on disability-related issues and has a couple of novels, or 3 novels, and a lot of short stories in that area. So we're very excited to have her reading from this recently released book. It's sort of a commentary on the story of O, for those of you who are familiar with it, from the perspective of the absented wife in that interaction. Okay, so I want to, maybe to save time because we're low, I'm not going to read all of the names, but I wanted to thank the working group that helped to organize this particular project. And there are probably some names that are missing there because people jumped in at the last minute. But it's been a really great concerted effort, and the graduate students did an enormous effort in outreaching, things like that. And I also want to say that we have very little funding, so we reached out all over the place on campus as well as to the UC-wide Black Studies group to fund this and bring in people from afar. And there's a long list here. Again, well, maybe I will read through this because it's important. The UC Consortium of Black Studies in California, the Institute of Arts and Humanities, Chicano Latino Arts and Humanities Program, the Department of Communication, the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Department of Literature, Critical Gender Studies, which is a program, the South Asia Institute, Third World Studies, the African and African American Research Center, Spaces, which is an organization that supports undergraduates' connections to the community, the UCSD Black Studies Project, the International Institute, the Social Sciences Division, the Graduate Student Association, the Disability Student Alliance, the University of San Diego, and this is University of San Diego as opposed to UCSD, the rest were UCSD, Department of Learning and Teaching, and the Qualcomm Institute of Cal IT Squared, which is where we're being hosted, and they donated their spatial facilities for this. It's also sponsored in part by the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and there's a statement there that says that none of the views expressed by us and the speakers are necessarily theirs, which is odd because they really pressed us to make sure that the views matched theirs. So I don't know what that was about, but there's a lot of legal stuff that goes on, as we know in this community. They only do it if they have to. I included it there in very fine print. I didn't know it would be quite so fine, but that's appropriate. I also want to welcome and thank our visiting professors. A lot of them have come from afar. We have people. And I also noted that one of the people in the audience came all the way from Arizona, so I'm just floored. I think we have a very dedicated and interesting audience. Small at this point, will probably increase throughout the day because of conflicting schedules and students. Okay, so regretfully on the program, Jada Raspberry of Dignity and Power now will not be able to attend because of family health issues. We do, however, have a group from Dignity and Power Now, which is a wonderful organization out of Los Angeles that has set up a sort of wellness chill room. They have acupuncture, they have rest spaces, they have herbs, tea, up on the 4th floor, which is very easy. There's an elevator around the corner. At any point people are stressed out or just need a break, you can go right up there, and they're great people to talk to. Now to the program. Yeah.
At the end of the slide about food?
Oh yeah, there's food. They're lost right now. I keep getting texts from them. United Women of East Africa that I work with and will be tabling. We're supposed to be here earlier, and they're bringing sambusa, and then we have other lunch food. So that'll be here throughout. The lunch food, other lunch food will come at about 2 o'clock. But there'll be plenty of sambusa and Ethiopian tea or Somali tea and things like that before then. Yeah, that's the food. Okay. So the work of our keynote presenter, Leroy Moore, was the spark that ignited this event. Suzanne Stultz over here, who's an old friend and a professor at Ucsd in learning and teaching, and I have been wanting to bring Leroy out here to San Diego for some time, recognizing him as someone who has been long dedicated to creative and activist work at the intersections of race, class, gender, and disability. As a poet, performer, scholar, musician, educator, and activist, his many productions have illuminated the need for expanded and more complicated understanding of disability identities. When we contacted him about visiting us this year, his suggestion of presenting on the topic of disability, race, and police violence set the planning for this program in motion. People with disabilities now and historically have been subject to institutional violence at a far greater rates than the so-called able-bodied population, a discrepancy that increases significantly among women, people of color, those living in poverty, etc., on and on. I don't even know if there are published statistics, but I would guess that this is the case for fat disabled people as well. Erin McCauley recently published a study in the American Journal of Public Health titled, quote, "The Cumulative Probability of Arrest by Age 28 Years in the United States by Disability Status, Race, Ethnicity, and Gender." As suggested in the title, her analysis of police data describes how the interaction of identity categories correlate with outcomes, with negative outcomes of policing. Quote, "For example, a black woman who has a disability is twice as likely to have been arrested by age 28 as a black woman who does not. While half of the black men without a disability will be arrested by age 28, those odds jump to 2 and 3 for black men with disability. We need to look critically at how violence plays out among the constellation of state institutions, and to respond to the ways that violence results from the collective actions and inactions. The much used metaphor of school to prison pipelines brings our attention to the implication of schools' discriminatory disciplinary apparatus in the racialized carceral system. At the same time, it fails to convey fully the overarching ways that intersectional violence is carried out across society through an array of state institutions of healthcare, social services, housing, schooling, policing, mental health, and we can go on and on. Intersections of disability and violence are replicated internationally, albeit in distinct and varied relations amongst differing stigmatized identities. But across these global variations, disability-related violence is consistent in its relationship to power and to the power and effects of institutions. A 2012 World Health Organization report on the heightened vulnerability of people with disabilities noted that factors which place people with disabilities at a higher risk of violence include stigma, discrimination, and ignorance about disability, as well as a lack of social support for those who care for them. Placement of people with disabilities in institutions also increases their vulnerability to violence, they noted in particular. In these settings and elsewhere, people with communication impairments are hampered in their ability to disclose abusive experiences. But it also relates to the types of training, the types of orientation that people in those institutions get, where there's a lack of recognition of what conditions people have. It's well established that 40% of people who are incarcerated have a serious mental issue. And that the largest treater of mental health in the United States is the criminal justice system. That's sort of a shocking thing that that's who's treating the largest quantity of people with mental health. This says as much about the likelihood of people with mental health concerns to be criminalized as it does about the criminalization as a factor in producing disability. And this is one of the sort of tough interactions that's true around all aspects of disability and harm in relationship to institutions. That it's not, if you look at poverty and disability, is it poverty that causes disability or disability that causes poverty? And it's really both and much more. It's a sort of constellation of institutions. The fact that those experiencing mental health conditions are nearly 4 times the risk of experiencing violence should give us much to reflect about the structural nature of intersections amongst violence, disability, and other oppressed identities. We are dealing with more than compounded biases. We must challenge the iterative ways in which the inequity of institutions and societal prejudices interact to generate and aggravate debility and vulnerability within particular bodies and communities. To address disability-related violence effectively through scholarly, creative, and advocacy work, we will have to be more attentive to the entwinement of disability with race, gender, religious affiliation, economic status, and other positionalities. These intersections do more than multiply vulnerabilities. They co-construct one another, and they structure social relations and shape everyday modes of thinking and interaction around difference. If these intersections are generative of harm and injustice, they also make possible affinities and coalitions. And I think that's something I want to underline here, that part of the intention of this symposium is to get people working together, thinking together to undo the types of violences. The TDS group initiated this symposium as a space for broadening awareness and as a platform for working together to generate responses to the multiple effective and political dimensions of institutional harms. As we all know, positive changes in state institutions don't come easily or quickly. And as the current administration demonstrates, negative transformations of these institutions is much more rapidly achieved. It involves long-term dedicated work, and I invite you to all keep this in mind as our presenters take up issues that I anticipate will be difficult and at times intense. Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to introduce the first set of speakers. Oh, just a note on format. We're not going to have a lot of times for Q&A at each of these 2 sessions. We're saving that mostly for a round table. I mean, we'll have a small amount because we know people come and go at the conference. So if you are attending the round table and can save your questions and allow people who might not be to get their questions in during this session, that would be great. But the roundtable we envision as much more participatory and dynamic, and we've dedicated an hour and 15 minutes or so to that, as well as time in the lobby for people to just talk. Thanks so much. Rachel, who's done probably the greatest legwork on this conference, is here to introduce the next speaker. And while you do that, I'll get his oh no, her PowerPoint is not.